So there's no question that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was left-wing. If you don't believe me, take a listen to some of the things that he said.
Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor. The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home. The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yeah.
One of his books, called Where Do We Go From Here, actually advocates universal employment, calls for the government to guarantee every citizen a job. Not exactly conservative free market economics. Now, the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had left-wing political views shouldn't be really surprising to anyone who's familiar with U.S. history. After all, it was the Communist Party that was one of the most outspoken advocates for the rights of African Americans. It raised issues like the Scottsboro 9 case, the case of Angelo Herndon, and back even in the 1920s and 30s, it included calls for racial equality and ends to segregation and Jim Crow in its political platform. This is the candidate for vice president from the Communist Party USA in 1940.
My people, the Negro people of America, have in the Communist Party their best defender, the unfailing champion of their cause. I accept this nomination for Vice President of the United States.
However, you wouldn't know any of this if you watched the Fox News universe. They've been rewriting the history of the civil rights movement. According to them, it was the Democrats and socialism that are racist, whereas Martin Luther King was a good free market conservative just like them. Take a listen.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. I repeat, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican.
This is about restoring honor. It is about the things that Martin Luther King stood for.
Damn it, we will reclaim the civil rights moment. We will take that movement because we were the people that did it in the first place.
We're really taking our direction from Martin Luther King.
Dinesh D'Souza is one of the most outspoken advocates of this historical revisionism. He's gone as far as making an entire documentary claiming that somehow socialism and Marxism is to blame for racism in the United States, and that it's conservatives and advocates of the free market that have been champions of civil rights.
What about Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave who became a champion of the abolitionist movement?
Republicans.
Democrats today will claim credit for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Those laws were all based upon constitutional provisions that had been put into the Constitution 100 years previously by the Republican Party. Had the racial preferences for whites to maintain the Democratic Party as the party of white supremacy in the South. Now they're doing it to basically buy votes. In either case, it's cynical exploitation.
Not only has Dinesh D'Souza engaged in this historical revisionism, he's actually gone as far as trying to say that he himself is like Dr. Martin Luther King. On Twitter, he has compared himself to Dr. Martin Luther King when he faced criminal charges for campaign finance violations. So now we have some new revelations from the FBI that shed some light on Dr. Martin Luther King's character, show him in a rather negative light. And suddenly, Dinesh D'Souza and the right, that have for so long been trying to tell us that Dr. Martin Luther King, a socialist, was a conservative just like they are, have flipped the script entirely.
And so the only guy that they've been able to push to the front is Martin Luther King. He's the only guy that they, in a sense, can cling to. So if they lose King, they've sort of lost their one claim to be a champion, if you will, of African American rights. So I think that this is a very awkward situation for them. Of course, the Me Too movement also came from the left. So this is not a right-wing critique that they can dismiss.
So Dinesh, were you lying when you presented Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement as right-wing like you? Or are you lying now when you attack the left over the history of Martin Luther King and their support for him? When were you lying, Dinesh? Before or now? And why does anyone take these forces seriously? That question must be asked. These are people that have completely reversed their historical narrative. Not only does Dinesh D'Souza try to rewrite the history of the civil rights movement, he also tries to rewrite the history of the Second World War. Apparently, Hitler was a liberal. Apparently, it was the Communist Party that is responsible for all racism. You have to ask yourself, if someone can be this dishonest and this misrepresentative of basic historical facts, why should you listen to them?
It is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And the question is whether America will do it. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. And the real question is whether we have the will